In Silverpine, Vermont, the snow covered everything, making the town feel peaceful in an almost haunting way. But somewhere inside an old, weathered train depot, one woman still carried the resentment and pain of being wrongfully blamed and scorned by an entire town that refused to understand her. Then one day, Caleb Whitaker returned with his German shepherd, Bishop, not to stand against the whole town, but to bring everything into the light and quietly repay an old debt. For 30 years, Mabel Corwin was treated like the reason Silverpine lost its future. What he found was not a hidden villain or some dark, carefully planned conspiracy, but a truth harder to accept than all of it, a truth everyone could have seen if they had been willing to look. If this story moves you, tell us where you're watching from, leave your thoughts below, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 5,000 subscribers so we can keep writing more meaningful stories. Snow had a way of making Silverpine look innocent. It softened the sharp roofs of the old wooden houses, covered the tire marks along Main Street, and turned the dark pines beyond town into rows of silent witnesses. Morning light poured over the mountains in a pale gold sheet, touching the church steeple, the bakery windows, the iron street lamps wrapped with winter garland. From a distance, Silverpine, Vermont looked like the kind of town people drove hours to find in December. Quiet, clean, bright with holiday lights and chimney smoke. Caleb Rowan Whitaker knew better than to trust what snow hid. He stood beside his truck at the edge of the town square, one gloved hand resting on the open door, the other holding a worn leather leash. At 57, Caleb still had the build of a man who had spent most of his life carrying weight without complaining. He stood a little over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, solid through the chest, though the old injury in his lower back made his movements slower than they once had been. His face was long and weathered, with high cheekbones, a nose that had been broken badly enough to remember it, and pale gray-blue eyes that watched before judging. His hair, dark brown gone silver at the temples, was cut short, but no longer military short. A close beard, rough with gray, lined his jaw. Under his charcoal field jacket, he wore an olive-drab combat shirt fitted close to the body, its camouflage sleeves marked by horizontal bands at the upper arms. It was practical, warm beneath layers, and familiar enough that he did not have to think about it. Caleb preferred clothing that did not ask to be noticed. Beside him, Bishop lowered his head and breathed in the cold. The German shepherd was 8 years old, large, black-backed, with honey gold fur along his chest and legs. His muzzle was dark, his eyes deep amber, and the left ear carried a small scar along the edge that made it tilt slightly when he listened. Bishop wore a plain dark green working harness with a small patch that read, "Working Partner." Nothing flashy, nothing sentimental. Caleb had learned long ago that the things that saved a man rarely announced themselves. "You remember cold, don't you?" Caleb murmured. Bishop looked up at him once, then back toward the square. The town smelled of roasted coffee, pine sap, wood smoke, cinnamon, and something sweet baking nearby. A woman in a red wool coat swept snow from the steps of the bakery. 2 men carried crates into a general store, their boots crunching in the fresh powder. Across the square, a banner had been stretched between 2 lampposts. Silverpine Winterlight Festival, Saturday evening. Caleb had not come for the festival. He had come because of a letter. It had been folded into the back of an old footlocker he had finally opened after years of moving it from one house to another. The paper had yellowed at the edges. The handwriting had been small, neat, and steady. "If you are ever alive enough to pass through Silverpine again, stop by the station. I still make tea before sunrise. Mabel Corwin. For 3 days after finding it, Caleb had carried the letter in his jacket pocket and told himself he was too busy to answer ghosts. Then, Bishop had begun sleeping beside the footlocker instead of near Caleb's bed, as if the dog understood that some things did not stop waiting simply because a man refused to look at them. 30 years ago, Caleb had arrived in Silverpine with no plan to stay alive for very long. He had been younger then, newly out of the army, angry in the way exhausted men often mistook for strength. He slept badly, drank worse, carried the war in his bones, and said nothing about it because silence felt cleaner than explanation. One February night, after a stretch of days he could barely remember, he had wandered near the old train station and passed out beside the freight room door. Mabel had found him before sunrise. She had not called the sheriff. She had not asked what he had seen, what he had done, or whether he deserved pity. She had unlocked the station, made him soup, given him a towel, and pointed to a narrow cot in the storage room. In the morning, she handed him a leash and said, "The dog needs walking. So do you." That was all. For 2 weeks, Caleb walked her old search dog along the abandoned rail line at dawn. For 2 weeks, Mabel fed him, scolded him, ignored his silences, and never once called him broken. Sometimes, a man survived not because someone dragged him back from the edge, but because someone gave him a small, ordinary duty and expected him to perform it. Caleb had meant to return. Life had become years. Years had become excuses. Now the station stood at the far end of the square, just beyond the shops, its brick walls dark red beneath frost, its arched windows filmed with age. The sign above the entrance still read Silverpine Depot, though no train had stopped there in decades. A single yellow bulb glowed inside the waiting room. Someone was keeping it alive. Caleb closed the truck door. "Come on, Bishop." They had taken only a few steps when the town's brightness thinned. It was not obvious at first. No one stared at Caleb for too long. No one turned away from him. But he felt the practiced caution of a small town measuring a stranger. Conversations lowered as he passed. A man at the hardware store window paused with a wreath in his hands. The woman sweeping the bakery steps smiled politely, then looked at Bishop and decided not to ask questions. Caleb accepted this. A man arriving in winter with a scarred German shepherd invited curiosity. What he did not understand came a few minutes later, inside the coffee shop. The place was warm and crowded, its windows fogged at the corners, its counter lined with jars of peppermint sticks and ginger cookies. Caleb took a table near the wall, where Bishop could settle at his feet without blocking the aisle. He ordered black coffee and a biscuit he did not want, then let his eyes move through the room. Old habit. 3 retired men near the front argued softly over a newspaper. A woman behind the counter filled cups without writing anything down. A couple in hiking jackets studied a tourist map. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. Then the bell over the door rang. The room changed before Caleb saw who had entered. Not dramatically. That would have been easier to understand. No one shouted, no one gasped. But voices faded as if someone had turned down a dial. The woman behind the counter stopped wiping a mug. One of the retired men lowered his newspaper, but did not look directly toward the door. An elderly woman stepped inside. She was small, no taller than 5'1", wrapped in a long charcoal coat and a wine-red scarf worn thin from use. Snow clung to the shoulders of her coat and to the edge of her gray knit hat. Her white hair was pinned low beneath it, though a few strands had escaped around her lined face. She held herself carefully, one gloved hand around a keyring that hung from a worn leather cord. Caleb knew her before his memory caught up with age. Mabel Corwin, 83 now, perhaps. Smaller than he remembered, but not diminished. There was nothing pleading in her face. Her green-gray eyes moved once across the room, not searching for kindness, only taking account of its absence. She approached the counter. "Morning, Lysa," she said. The woman behind the counter busied herself with the register. "Morning. A small chocolate, if you have it." "We have it." Mabel waited. A man in a quilted vest stepped in behind her. Then another customer moved closer. The counter woman served them both first. Mabel stood there with her coins ready, her expression unchanged. Caleb felt Bishop shift beneath the table. Not rising, not warning, just noticing. A middle-aged man at the end of the counter gave a dry laugh and slid 3 coins across the wood. They spun once before settling near Mabel's hand. "Let her pay for that," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough for the room to hear. "Maybe she can start paying back what she took from the rest of us." No one laughed. That made it worse. Mabel looked at the coins, then at the counterwoman. Then she put her own money away. "Never mind," she said. She turned and walked out. The bell rang again. Conversation did not resume immediately. Caleb's hand had closed around his coffee cup hard enough for the ceramic to press into his palm. He had seen cruelty in many forms, but this kind unsettled him most. The kind that had been rehearsed for so long, it no longer required anger. The man at the counter did not look proud. The woman behind the counter did not look ashamed. The room simply adjusted around what had happened, as if an old piece of furniture had been moved aside. Bishop stood. Caleb did not give a command. Bishop rarely needed one when the right thing was simple. The German shepherd walked to the door, stopped, and looked back. Caleb left money on the table and followed. Outside, Mabel had reached the corner of the square. She had paused beneath a lamppost where festival garland trembled in the wind. The snow had begun again, fine and bright, turning the air between buildings into a veil. For a moment, she looked less like a woman leaving a coffee shop and more like someone standing at the edge of a memory she refused to enter. Bishop went to her slowly. Caleb held the leash loose. The dog did not jump, did not press, did not demand affection. He stopped at arm's length and lowered his head. Mabel looked down at him, and something in her face changed. Not softened exactly, but steadied. She removed one glove with care and held her bare hand still, palm down. Bishop stepped forward and touched his muzzle to her fingers. "Well," Mabel whispered, "you were taught properly." Caleb stopped a few feet away. Most people reached for a dog's head. Mabel did not. She let Bishop decide the distance. She watched his shoulders, his ears, his breath. When she finally touched him, it was at the side of the neck, light and respectful. "German Shepherd," she said. "Working lines, not too heavy. Good hips, I'd wager. And that left ear has heard more truth than most people in this town." Bishop's tail moved once. Caleb felt something old inside him loosen and ache at the same time. "Mabel," he said. She looked up. For a heartbeat, there was no recognition. Then her eyes narrowed, studying the beard, the gray hair, the scar of age rather than battle. "Caleb Whitaker," she said at last. He nodded. "You got old." So did you. I had a head start. The corner of his mouth lifted despite himself. There it was, the dry, unvarnished mercy he remembered. Not softness, not pity. Something better. I found your letter, he said. Must have taken the scenic route. 30 years. That is a long route. He wanted to apologize then. The word rose naturally, heavily. Sorry for not writing. Sorry for leaving. Sorry for letting decades pass while she remained here, apparently hated by people who decorated their windows with peace and goodwill every winter. But Mabel's eyes warned him not to spend apology cheaply. So he said, I came to see the station. She looked past him toward the old depot. Then you came before they sell it. Before Caleb could ask who they were, a voice called from across the street. Mrs. Corwin! A man approached from the direction of the town hall. He wore a tailored gray wool coat, polished boots, black leather gloves, and a burgundy scarf tucked neatly at his throat. His silver hair was combed back with careful precision, and he moved with the controlled confidence of someone used to being heard before he raised his voice. Caleb knew the type. Not military. Civic. A man who could make a threat sound like an agenda item. Mabel put her glove back on. Mr. Voss, she said. The man's eyes moved briefly to Caleb, then to Bishop, then returned to Mabel with a practiced smile. I hoped to find you at the station, he said, but this will do. You usually hope to find me nowhere at all. The smile did not break. The council meets tomorrow evening to finalize the public notice. The vote on the depot property will be held before the festival. Caleb watched Mabel's fingers tighten around the keyring. The vote, she repeated. We have a serious buyer. North Star Leisure Group is prepared to invest in the site, restore taxable value, and bring badly needed work into Silverpine. Graham Voss spoke gently, almost regretfully. This town cannot live forever inside a building that no longer serves it. Mabel said nothing. Graham's tone lowered. The council will also be requesting the return of the depot keys, officially this time. The old caretaker arrangement has gone on longer than anyone intended. The wind moved through the square. Somewhere behind them, the coffee shop bell rang again, and voices spilled briefly into the cold before the door closed. Caleb looked at the station. The yellow bulb inside burned small and stubborn behind the frosted glass. Mabel lifted the key ring. The metal keys clicked softly against one another. You can take the keys, she said. Graham waited. Mabel looked at the depot, not at him. But you cannot take what that place remembers. For the first time, Graham's polite expression thinned. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for Caleb. Bishop stepped closer to Mabel, his shoulder nearly touching her coat. No growl. No command. Just presence. And in that moment, Caleb understood two things with the quiet certainty of a man who had survived by learning what rooms did not say. Silverpine had wrapped itself in snow and lights to hide an old wound. And Mabel Corwin was standing alone at the center of it, still holding the key. Callahan House sat on the north edge of Silverpine, where Main Street narrowed into a road lined with black pines and snowbanks high enough to hide the lower fences. It was not really a hotel, though the sign out front called it one. It was a 3-story white house with green shutters, a porch wrapped in old Christmas lights, and a brass bell on the front desk that looked as if it had been polished every morning since Eisenhower. The lobby smelled of coffee, cinnamon, wood polish, and clean laundry. A stone fireplace burned low against one wall, and above it hung a framed photograph of the Silverpine depot in better years. Platform crowded, windows bright, smoke rising behind a waiting train. Caleb noticed the photograph before he noticed the woman behind the desk. "Mr. Whitaker," she called, as if she had been expecting him to arrive 10 minutes late and had already forgiven him for it. June Callahan came around the counter with a ring of room keys in one hand and a folded receipt in the other. She was short, round-faced, and quick in every movement, with dark blonde hair streaked silver and tied back with a red cloth band. Her cheeks were pink, from heat or habit, and her smile appeared easily, though it did not always stay long enough to mean what it promised. "I put you on the second floor," she said. "Back corner, quieter, less draft. Your dog will have room to stretch." "Appreciate it." Bishop stood beside Caleb's left leg, snow melting along the dark ridge of his back. June looked down at him, and her smile became real for a moment. "Well, aren't you a handsome old soldier?" "He's not a soldier," Caleb said. "He's retired from helping them." June's face softened. "That's a better kind of service, maybe." She reached toward the counter, pulled out a small towel, and handed it to Caleb without making a fuss. Bishop allowed his paws to be wiped, one after another, with the patience of a creature accustomed to human rules, as long as they made sense. "You've been here before," June said as she led Caleb toward the stairs. "Haven't you?" "A long time ago." "I thought so. Your face tugged at something. My mother ran this place then." Caleb glanced again at the framed depot photograph. "I stayed somewhere else." June followed his eyes, and the room's warmth seemed to draw back a little. "At the station?" she asked. "For a while." The word station changed her posture more than Mabel's name had changed the coffee shop. June did not stop moving, but she slowed. Her keys, which had been jingling brightly in her hand, fell quiet against her palm. "That was a different time," she said. "People keep saying things like that around here." June gave a brief laugh, not amused. "Because it's true." On the second floor, she opened a room with a sloped ceiling, a quilted bedspread, and 2 windows facing the pines. A ceramic bowl had already been placed near the door for Bishop. Beside it sat a folded wool blanket. "House rules are simple," June said, returning to her practiced brightness. "No smoking, no candles, no muddy boots on the bedspread. Breakfast is from 6:30 to 9. If you need extra towels, ask before midnight, because after midnight, I become a less generous Christian." Caleb set his duffel near the dresser. "I ran into Mabel Corwin this morning." June's hand tightened around the keyring. There it was again. Not hatred, not exactly fear, a small inward flinch. "I wondered when that would come up," she said. "You know her?" "Everyone knows Mrs. Corwin." "That isn't what I asked." June turned toward the window. Outside, snow sifted through the dark pines like ash made clean. "Mr. Whitaker, I make beds, pour coffee, and keep this house from freezing solid. I don't referee old wars." "Was it a war?" "It was worse." She looked back at him. "Wars end on paper." Caleb said nothing. June sighed, and the sound carried years of wanting to be kind without paying too much for it. "You seem like a decent man, so I'll say this once. Don't dig around in that story. Silverpine has wounds under the snow, and some of them bleed if you warm them too fast." "What did she do?" June's face closed, not cruelly, but like a shopkeeper turning the sign from open to closed. "She made sure this town never became what it could have been." Then she handed him the room key and left before he could ask what that meant. Caleb stood in the quiet room for a long moment. Bishop walked to the bowl, drank once, then went to the window. He did not settle. his ears angled toward town. "Yeah," Caleb said. "I heard it too." But there had been no sound, only the shape of a story waiting below them. By late afternoon, Caleb had learned that Silverpine did not gossip loudly. It preferred to speak in fragments, each one dropped like a coin into a jar. At the general store, the man at the register told him the depot used to employ half the valley, if you counted the crews, freight hands, hotels, diners, repair shops, and men who hauled timber down from the ridges. At the post office, a woman sorting packages said the railroad expansion would have changed everything. "Not made us rich," she said, as if defending herself against foolish hope. "Just stable." At the hardware store, an old calendar still showed a faded picture of a freight train crossing a snow-covered trestle. The owner tapped the image with one finger and said, "That used to mean paychecks." No one began with Mabel. Everyone ended there. The story assembled itself reluctantly. More than 30 years earlier, Silverpine had been offered a contract tied to a northern rail expansion. The line would have carried mining equipment and winter freight through North Ravine, bringing money, repairs, crews, suppliers, and a future big enough for people to stop leaving. The town had already begun to imagine new storefronts, new roofs, school repairs, younger families moving back. Then, Mabel Corwin, signal coordinator at the depot, refused to sign off on part of the safety clearance. One signature. That was how people told it. One signature delayed the schedule. The delay frightened the investors. The investors chose another route. The route took the money with it. Within 2 years, the depot was limping. Within 5, it was closed. People did not say Mabel had made an error. They said she had killed the town's future. Caleb heard the phrase 3 times before dusk. By then, the cold had deepened, turning the edges of his breath white. He and Bishop crossed toward a narrow shop tucked between the pharmacy and an empty storefront whose windows had been painted with snowflakes to hide the fact that nothing stood behind them. A sign over the door read, "Pike Leather and Repair." Inside, the air smelled of tanned hide, beeswax, and old smoke. Strips of leather hung from hooks. Boots lined one wall, saddlebags another. Behind the workbench stood a woman with a utility knife in one hand and a half-repaired harness under the other. She had a strong build, chin-length brown hair clipped away from her face, and hands that looked more honest than polite. She glanced at Bishop first. "Workin' dog?" "Retired," Caleb said. "Still workin' then?" He almost smiled. "In some ways." "I'm Nora Pike." "Caleb Whitaker." "I know. June called ahead." "Is that normal?" "In Silverpine? Breathing too loudly is a public event." Nora returned to the harness, drawing the blade through leather in one smooth, practiced motion. "I'm looking for someone who can repair a leash," Caleb said, though the leash in his hand needed no repair. "Leave it on the counter." He did. Bishop remained beside him, eyes moving across the shop, calm but attentive. On the back wall hung a black and white photograph of men standing along a rail line, shovels in hand, faces half hidden by winter caps. One of them had Nora's eyes. "Your family worked the railroad?" Caleb asked. "My father maintained track until there wasn't track worth maintaining." "What happened to him?" Nora's knife stopped. Then she set it down. "He lost his job, then his house, then his pride. The last one took the longest." Her voice was flat, controlled by force. "He died years later in a rented room outside Burlington. Liver gave out before his heart did." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. He didn't know you. There was no invitation in her tone, but no performance either. Caleb respected that. "You blame Mabel Corwin," he said. Nora looked at him then. Her eyes were amber brown, hot with something that had survived too long to call anger alone. "My father blamed himself until it ate him alive. My mother blamed the company. Men at the bar blamed weather, taxes, outsiders, bad luck." She picked up the harness again. "The only thing this town ever agreed on was Mabel." "That doesn't make it true." "No," Nora said, "but it made it livable." The words struck harder than accusation. Bishop shifted, not toward Nora, not away from her, simply enough that his tag clicked softly against the ring of his collar. Nora heard it. Her gaze dropped to him. For the first time, her expression changed. Not softened exactly, but lost its edge. "My father had a shepherd when I was small," she said. "Dog waited by the door 3 months after he left for work that last time. Wouldn't sleep anywhere else." Caleb did not answer. Nora returned the leash after checking the stitching, though it had needed nothing. "No charge. Nothing wrong with it." "I know." "Then why come in?" "To hear how people say her name when they think they're telling the truth." Nora studied him for a long second. "Careful, Mr. Whitaker. Around here, truth isn't the dangerous part. It's what people had to survive after it." Outside, the winter light had begun to fade blue. Caleb walked with Bishop past the depot, then down a road where the houses thinned and the old rail line emerged from beneath wind-blown snow. The tracks had been cut in places, swallowed in others, but their direction remained visible like a scar that refused to close. At the end of a lane stood a small gray house with a sagging porch and a rusted rail lantern hanging beside the door. Elias Benton answered only after Caleb knocked twice. He was tall once, Caleb guessed, though age had folded him inward. At 70, Elias seemed made of narrow bones, wool, and hesitation. He wore a tweed cap indoors, and his thin white hair curled below it. His eyes were pale gray, filmed slightly with age. But when he saw Bishop, something in them sharpened. "I don't need anything," Elias said. "I'm not selling." "Then I don't have anything to give." "I'm asking about the depot." Elias's hand tightened on the doorframe. Behind him, Caleb saw the dim outline of a room, crowded with old timetables, stacked newspapers, a chair by the stove, and on the wall, a conductor's cap hung like a relic too painful to throw away. "You worked there," Caleb said. "So did a lot of men." "With Mabel Corwin?" Elias looked past Caleb toward the road. For 1 second, his face did not show disgust. It showed exhaustion. Then shame moved through it so quickly, a less patient man might have missed it. "That name doesn't do anyone any good," Elias muttered. "Did she do what they say?" Elias's mouth opened. No sound came. Bishop took one slow step forward and sat down in the snow, not begging entrance, not demanding trust. The old man looked at the dog for a long time. "My wife liked shepherds," Elias said, as if answering a different question. Then he closed the door. Caleb stayed on the porch long enough to hear the bolt slide into place. He did not knock again. Some doors, he knew, did not open because a man wanted answers. Some opened only when the person inside could no longer bear the sound of his own silence. Evening settled over Silverpine in layers of blue and gold. The lamps came on along Main Street. The festival lights glowed brighter against the gathering dark. People moved through the square carrying paper cups and grocery bags, their voices rising now that the day's work was done.
Caleb found the library still open. It occupied a former town office, brick-fronted and narrow, with frosted windows and a hand-painted sign that read Silverpine Public Library and Archives. Inside, the heat clicked through old radiators. The room smelled of paper, dust, and peppermint tea.
Behind the circulation desk sat Marianne Holt, a slender woman in her mid-50s, wearing a gray cardigan and round glasses on a chain. Her chestnut hair, threaded with silver, was pinned in a loose knot that looked as if it had been rebuilt several times throughout the day. She was stamping due dates into a stack of books, though there appeared to be no one waiting for them. When Caleb asked about old railroad records, she did not flinch the way June had, but she did look toward the front windows before answering. "That depends what you need them for." Understanding. A faint, tired smile crossed her face. People usually say that when they mean ammunition. "I'm not here to fight your town." "No," Marianne said quietly, "but you may not get to choose whether the town feels attacked." She led him to a side table, pulled a drawer of catalog cards, and began writing call numbers on a slip of paper. Her hands were careful, precise. Bishop lay beneath the table without being told, his body angled where he could see both the door and Caleb. "You knew Mabel?" Caleb asked. "I know of her." "That's a librarian's answer." "It is a citizen's answer." Marianne paused, pencil hovering. "Mrs. Corwin comes in twice a month, returns books on time, never asks for help reaching the upper shelves, even when she should." "You believe what they say about her?" Marianne removed her glasses and cleaned them with the edge of her cardigan. It bought her time, but not enough to hide the discomfort. "I believe," she said slowly, "that towns can become very loyal to the story that hurts the least." "Does that mean the story is false?" "It means people stopped asking that question before I was old enough to work here." She handed him the slip of paper. "Basement archives are by appointment only. Council records require approval. Newspaper reels are available during library hours." "Council approval from Voss?" Marianne's eyes flicked toward the window again. "From the council office."
"That isn't a no."
"No," she said, "it is not."
The front door opened then, bringing cold air and the faint chime of the bell. Graham Voss entered as if the building had been expecting him. His overcoat was dark and perfectly brushed, his burgundy scarf neat at the throat. He greeted Marianne by name, nodded to Caleb, and looked briefly at Bishop without the uneasy smile many people gave large dogs. "Mr. Whitaker," Graham said. "Settling in?" "Trying to." Silverpine can be difficult to understand from the outside. I've noticed people on the inside don't agree on it either. Marianne lowered her gaze to the desk. Graham's smile remained smooth. Disagreement is not always unhealthy. Stagnation is, which is why the depot vote matters. North Star Leisure Group is offering us a chance to bring employment back, real employment, not nostalgia. And Mabel Corwin? A small pause. Mrs.
Corwin has lived a long life inside her own interpretation of events, Graham said. I don't begrudge an elderly woman her attachments. Bishop raised his head, not sharply, not with alarm. He simply looked toward the front windows, where across the square, through falling snow and lamplight, Mabel could be seen entering the depot alone. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. Inside the station, the yellow bulb came on. Graham continued speaking, something about taxable value and infrastructure grants, but Caleb heard less of it now. He watched Mabel move behind the frosted glass, a small figure in a dark coat, passing between benches no one else cared enough to dust. She did not look defeated. That was what unsettled him. She looked like someone performing a duty after everyone else had forgotten the oath. Bishop stood. This time, Caleb understood the signal not as warning, but as invitation. He turned back to Graham. "Excuse me." The older man's expression tightened almost imperceptibly.
"Of course." Caleb left the library and crossed the square through the snow. The depot door was unlocked. Inside, the old waiting room smelled of cold wood, dust, lamp oil, and faintly of lemon polish. Mabel stood near the ticket window, wiping the sill with a cloth. Her key ring hung from the pocket of her apron, metal against worn leather. "You've been busy," she said without turning. "People talk. They always have. They say you killed the town's future. That is the shorter version. What is the longer one?" Mabel folded the cloth once, then again. "Longer versions require people willing to sit still." Caleb looked around the depot, the benches, the dark ticket booth, the clock that had stopped at some hour nobody had bothered to correct. "Why stay?" he asked. "If they hate you this much, why not leave?" Mabel finally turned. In the yellow light, she seemed older than she had outside, and stronger than she had any right to be. Snow melted along the hem of her coat. Her eyes held no tears, only the hard shine of someone who had spent decades refusing to spend them where they would be wasted. "Because people leave," she said, "when there is nothing left for them to keep." Her hand closed around the keys. "I still have the key." Mabel Corwin lived where Silverpine began to lose interest in itself. Her house stood beyond the last neat row of shops and guest cottages, past the plowed road where tire tracks turned soft and uncertain, at the edge of a pine wood that leaned close in winter. Snow weighed down the branches until they nearly touched the porch roof. A narrow path had been shoveled from the gate to the front steps, not wide enough for two people to walk side by side, but clean, deliberate, and maintained with the stubborn care of someone who refused to let weather decide the terms of her life. Caleb stopped at the gate. The cottage was smaller than he remembered, or perhaps everything from 30 years ago had grown large in the place's memory kept it. The windows glowed amber against the early dusk. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady line before the wind broke it apart. On the porch rail, several glass jars hung from wire loops, each filled with dried flowers, brown-eyed Susans, lavender, brittle sprigs of yarrow, preserved long past their season. Bishop stood beside Caleb, ears forward, body loose. "You sure?" Caleb asked him quietly. The German shepherd did not look up. He simply stepped through the open gate and waited on the path, as if the question had been unnecessary. Caleb exhaled, feeling the old tightness in his lower back sharpen in the cold. He had faced doors that hid men with rifles behind them. He had knocked on hospital rooms, barracks offices, homes where bad news arrived before he did. Yet this little cottage unsettled him more than any of those. There were debts that could not be paid with courage. He climbed the porch steps and knocked. Mabel opened the door before the second knock landed. She wore a cream-colored sweater beneath a faded blue shawl, her white hair pinned at the back of her head with a small silver clip shaped like two crossing rails. Her face was lined and pale from winter, but her eyes were clear. She looked first at Bishop, then at Caleb. "You took longer than I expected," she said. "I didn't know I was expected." "That makes one of us." She stepped aside. The cottage smelled of wood smoke, black tea, ginger,
and old paper. It was warm without being soft. The front room held a narrow sofa, a rocking chair near the stove, and shelves crowded with weather notebooks, railroad maps, and glass jars labeled in small handwriting. No photographs claimed the walls except landscapes. The depot in winter, North Ravine under spring fog, a rail bridge at sunrise, pine trees leaning under snow. Caleb noticed the absence before he knew what he was looking for. No wedding portrait, no family gathering, no smiling faces. Mabel saw him notice.
"If you came to inventory my ghosts," she said, "take your boots off first."
Caleb removed his boots by the door. Bishop waited until Mabel gave a small nod before stepping inside. He sniffed once, not nosing into corners, not restless, then lowered himself beside the stove as if the room had passed inspection. Mabel watched him with quiet approval. "He has manners." "He has standards," Caleb said. "So did the last dog I trusted." Caleb heard Arthur in the sentence, though she had not said the name yet. Mabel moved toward the kitchen. Her gait was slow but efficient, a woman measuring the distance between tasks and refusing waste. She set a kettle on the stove, placed 2 cups on the table, then opened a tin and took out ginger cookies that looked homemade, hard, and entirely unwilling to flatter anyone. "Sit," she said. "I can help." "You can sit. That will help me less, but it will irritate me less too." He sat. The kitchen was small, cleaner than most barracks inspections Caleb had endured. A railway timetable from decades ago lay flattened under glass on one side of the table. Beside it sat a notebook, opened to a page of weather observations. Temperature, wind direction, snowfall, barometric pressure. The entries were dated in Mabel's careful hand. "You still keep records," Caleb said. "People who don't keep records are too easily persuaded by men with loud voices." The kettle began to tremble. Caleb almost smiled, but the movement caught somewhere in his chest. When she placed the tea before him, Mabel lowered herself into the chair across from him and studied his face with the same frankness she had used 30 years earlier. No sentiment, no theatrical reunion. Just a tension sharp enough to feel like judgment and mercy at the same time. "Do you still drink to sleep?" she asked. The question crossed the table and found him, with more accuracy than he liked. Caleb looked down at the tea. Steam moved across his knuckles. "Less," he said. Mabel nodded. Not congratulation, not disappointment. Acceptance of a battlefield report. "Less is sometimes a respectable direction." He swallowed once. "I should have written." "Yes." "I should have come back." "Yes." He looked at her then. Mabel lifted her cup. "Do not make me comfort you for feeling guilty, Caleb Whitaker. I am 83. My patience has become a luxury item." The old sting of her directness nearly made him laugh. Nearly. "I didn't come for comfort." "No. Men your age usually come for absolution and call it closure." "That what you think I'm doing?" "I think you found an old letter and decided the past had become polite enough to visit." Caleb sat back slowly. Bishop raised his head from near the stove, eyes moving between them. For a moment, Caleb felt the familiar pressure behind his ribs, the instinct to defend, explain, organize pain into something useful. He had not come here to be dismantled by an old woman with tea. But Mabel's gaze did not waver, and he remembered, with uncomfortable clarity, that she had never once allowed him to perform suffering for sympathy. 30 years ago, that had saved him. Maybe it still could. "You gave me a cot," he said. "Soup, work, A leash? You never asked me what happened.
You would have lied.
Probably.
You also smelled like whiskey and wet wool. I had enough to manage.
This time he did laugh, quietly. It faded quickly, but it was real. Mabel's expression softened by the smallest degree.
I did not save you,
she said.
You helped.
Yes, helping is allowed. Saving makes the saved person into property. Caleb looked toward Bishop. The dog had settled again, chin on his paws, though his ears remained aware. I trained dogs for men who thought they were too far gone, Caleb said. Some women, too. Veterans, search teams, responders.
I spent years telling them the same thing. The dog is not there to fix you. The dog is there to stay while you learn how.
Mabel's fingers tightened around her cup.
Then you learned something.
Eventually. The stove popped softly. Wind moved against the windows. For the first time since Caleb had entered, silence did not feel like something blocking the room. It felt like something making space. Mabel looked at Bishop.
My Arthur would have liked him.
There it was. The name landed without ceremony, but the room changed around it. Your husband, Caleb said.
My husband,
she repeated. She rose before he could offer help and walked to a shelf near the stove. From it, she took a small wooden box, not hidden, not locked, simply placed among ordinary things. Inside were dog tags, not military tags, but brass nameplates from old collars. Caleb could read some of the names from where he sat. Jasper, Ruthie, Miles, Old Ben.
Arthur trained local search dogs before the county decided paperwork mattered more than instinct, Mabel said. Lost hikers, avalanche drills, missing hunters, foolish tourists who thought mountains cared about confidence. He was good with dogs because he never confused obedience with trust. She held one brass plate between her fingers. He taught me not to reach for a frightened animal. Let it choose. If it comes, you have been given something. If it does not, you have not been insulted.
Caleb watched Bishop slowly lift his head. Mabel did not look at the dog now. Her eyes had shifted inward, toward some room time had sealed badly.
When the town turned on me, they turned on Arthur too. Not all at once. That would have been easier. They stopped asking him to repair things, stopped inviting him to search trainings. Men he had pulled out of ravines crossed the street to avoid shaking his hand.
Her thumb moved over the brass nameplate.
He said it did not matter.
Which meant it did.
Caleb's jaw tightened. What happened to him? His heart failed 4 winters later. I'm sorry. Mabel placed the nameplate back in the box. So was I. There was no accusation in it. That made it worse. Caleb felt heat rise beneath his collar, not at Mabel, at the town, at men who let pride dress itself as public opinion, at rooms full of people who knew how to remain decent until decency cost them something. Bishop stood. The movement was quiet but immediate. He crossed the small kitchen and placed one heady paw on Caleb's boot. Caleb looked down. The dog did not stare at him. He simply kept the paw there, grounding weight through leather and bone. Caleb breathed out through his nose. Mabel watched the exchange. He knows when you're about to become loud. I don't get loud. No, Mabel said. You get still in a way that makes other people wish you would get loud instead. Caleb had no answer for that.
Bishop removed his paw only after Caleb's hand loosened from the edge of the table. Mabel returned to her chair, but she seemed farther away now, as if speaking Arthur's name had opened a corridor she had spent years avoiding. "I tried once," she said. Caleb did not ask what. He waited. "To explain, after the contract fell through, before the depot closed, before people had finished deciding what I was." She turned her cup slowly between both hands. "There was a town meeting in the old hall. Graham Voss's father stood at the front like a man announcing weather he had personally arranged. I brought notes, dispatch logs, safety objections, a request for a second geological review." "What happened?" "He smiled." She said it with such distaste that Caleb could picture it. "That was the worst part," Mabel continued. "Not shouting, not rage, a smile. He told them I was frightened of responsibility, that a woman who spent too much time alone with timetables had mistaken anxiety for expertise. He said Silverpine needed work, not superstition." Her mouth tightened. Someone laughed. Then more of them did. Some did not laugh. Those were the ones I remembered longer. Why? Because they knew better than to laugh and still did nothing. The room seemed to narrow around her voice. "I stood there holding papers that suddenly weighed less than their hunger, their mortgages, their closed shops, their sons and daughters leaving for Burlington and Albany and places that had not disappointed them yet." Caleb heard the danger in that sentence, not because it excused what had happened, but because Mabel understood it too well. She had never allowed herself the simpler comfort of believing everyone who hurt her was evil. "That was the last time?" he asked. "The last time I asked a room to give me back my dignity." Outside, a gust of wind swept snow against the glass. Bishop left Caleb then. He crossed to Mabel's chair and lay down beside it, not touching her at first. He waited. After a few breaths, Mabel lowered her hand. Bishop shifted closer until her fingers rested against the thick fur at his neck. Her hand trembled once, then steadied. Caleb looked away. There were moments that did not belong to witnesses, even friendly ones. When Mabel spoke again, her voice had changed. It was not softer, but it had lost the blade she used to keep people at a distance. "You want to know what I did?" "Yes." "I refused to sign a clearance." "For the expansion?" "For the North Ravine route." She rose again, this time more slowly, and took a rolled map from a wooden tube near the pantry. She spread it across the kitchen table, weighing the corners with a salt shaker, a teacup, a smooth stone, and a tin of matches. The map showed the valley in lines and numbers, ridges, switchbacks, drainage paths, a narrow ravine cutting through the mountains north of town. Mabel tapped it with one thin finger. "There." Caleb leaned closer. "The company wanted winter freight through this passage, heavy loads, long cars, steeper grade than they liked to admit. The preliminary report mentioned unstable snowpack, water seepage behind the rock shelf, and prior slides along the east wall." "You saw the report?" "I saw enough. More importantly, I saw what was missing from the version they wanted filed." "You weren't a geologist." "No, I was a signal coordinator. My job was to know when a schedule was lying about safety." That sentence settled into Caleb with force. Mabel kept her finger on the ravine. "My signature did not approve the geology, but it confirmed that the proposed operating schedule could be safely integrated into the line under the documentation provided. I could not confirm that, not honestly." "So you asked for another review?" "Yes." "And that delayed the contract?" "Yes." "And the investors left?" "Yes." She said each word plainly, refusing both apology and pride. Caleb studied the map. "Do you believe people would have died?" Mabel looked at him for a long moment. "I do not know." The answer surprised him. Perhaps she saw that. "That is the part no one wants from truth," she said. "They want certainty. They want me to say I saved 100 men from disaster. They want me to say I was right in a way that makes their suffering small." Her voice grew quieter. "I cannot say that. I can only say I was asked to sign that something dangerous was safe, and I did not." Caleb understood then why she had survived so bitterly and so cleanly at once. She had not built her life around a glorious vindication. She had built it around a refusal. A refusal was harder to worship, harder to forgive, too. "Why not tell me this 30 years ago?" he asked. "You were trying not to die." "That doesn't answer the question." "It does if you remember yourself honestly." He did. He remembered the storage room, the sour taste of old liquor, the way dawn had hurt his eyes, Mabel's voice telling him the dog needed walking. He had been too full of his own wreckage to hold anyone else's. "I wouldn't have heard you," he said. "No." "And now?" Mabel looked down at Bishop, whose head rested near her shoe. "Now you are listening. That is different." The fire in the stove had burned lower. Caleb rose to add a log before remembering it was not his house. Mabel noticed and gave a small nod. Permission, not dependence. He placed the split wood inside. Sparks lifted and vanished. When he returned to the table, the map remained open between them like a wound drawn in ink. "I can ask questions," Caleb said. "Look for records. Talk to people who might remember." "You can." "But you don't want me to." "I did not say that." "What are you saying?" Mabel folded the map with care, aligning each crease exactly where it had been worn before. "I am saying I will not be your mission." Caleb held her gaze. "I had enough men decide what my life meant when they wanted someone to blame. I do not need another man deciding it means redemption." "Well, that isn't what I'm doing." "Isn't it?" The question struck because it was fair. Caleb thought of the letter in his pocket, of the guilt he had carried into town like an offering, of how easily gratitude could become another form of control if a man was not careful. "I don't know," he said honestly. Mabel seemed to respect that more than any promise he might have made. "Then start there." The clock on the mantel ticked, though its hands had stopped at some old hour. Bishop sighed beside Mabel's chair, heavy and content. At last, Caleb asked, "What do you want?" Mabel did not answer quickly. For a while she looked toward the dark window where the room reflected back. An old woman, an old soldier, an old dog, a table full of maps, and a town beyond the glass pretending the snow made everything clean. "I do not need them to love me," she said. Her voice was steady, but Caleb heard the years beneath it. "I am simply tired of being the person they use so they do not have to hate their own choices." Caleb sat with that. He had heard confessions before. Last words, angry truths, drunken truths, official truths written to survive review. But this was something else. Not a plea, not an accusation, not even a request. It was a boundary. Mabel Corwin did not need saving. She needed the world to stop calling her survival a crime. Caleb did not sleep well after leaving Mabel's cottage. That by itself was not unusual. Sleep had never been a place he entered easily. But this was different from the old dreams, different from the sharp flashes that used to drag him awake with his hands clenched and his throat dry. This was quieter, more orderly. A map spread itself behind his eyes every time he closed them. North Ravine, the proposed winter freight line, the narrow cut through the mountains. Mabel's finger resting on the place where certainty ended. I was asked to sign that something dangerous was safe, and I did not. By morning, Silverpine looked freshly made again. Overnight snow had erased footprints from the square. The bakery windows glowed. A man shoveled the church steps. 2 tourists took photographs of the depot as if it were charming rather than contested. The town kept renewing its surface with impressive discipline. Caleb stood outside Callahan House with Bishop at his side and watched Mabel cross the square. She wore her long charcoal coat, the wine-red scarf wrapped once around her neck, her key ring tucked somewhere out of sight. She did not look left or right. People noticed her anyway. The noticing moved ahead of her like a cold draft. Small pauses, glances lowered, conversations rerouted. No one insulted her. No one had to. From the porch, June Callahan appeared with a broom in her hand and a mug of coffee balanced on the railing. She followed Caleb's gaze, then quickly looked away. "Breakfast is still hot," she said. "I'll eat later." People say that before they make poor choices on an empty stomach. He glanced at her. June tightened her grip on the broom. "You're going to the library." "Probably." "Marianne won't like being pulled into this." "Then she can tell me no." June gave a short, humorless laugh. "Men always think no is the hard part. Around here, the hard part is what happens after yes." Caleb did not argue. Bishop lifted his head toward the square where Mabel had reached the depot door. She unlocked it, stepped inside, and a moment later the yellow bulb appeared in the frosted window. June saw it too. Her expression shifted before she could hide it. Guilt, maybe, or longing for a version of herself that had once been braver. "She opens that place every morning," June said quietly. "Even when no one thanks her. Even when the council sends notices. Even when boys, grown men now, I suppose, used to stuff snow through the mail slot." Caleb turned toward her. June's mouth tightened. "I didn't say I was proud of knowing that." "No," Caleb said. "You didn't." She looked down at the broom, as if surprised to find it in her hand. "Marianne keeps the old newspaper reels downstairs. She'll pretend she can't access them without an appointment. Tell her I said she still owes me for the Thanksgiving pipe burst of 2018. Will that help?" It will annoy her enough to help. For the first time that morning, Caleb smiled. The library was quiet when he arrived, quiet in a way different from Mabel's cottage. Mabel's house held silence like a chosen tool. The library held it like a held breath. Marianne Holt looked up from behind the circulation desk. Today she wore a blue-gray sweater and had a pencil tucked through the knot of her hair. Several slips of paper were spread before her, each marked in her small, precise handwriting. Her eyes moved from Caleb to Bishop, then to the window beyond them, toward the depot. "You came early," she said. "I didn't sleep." "That is not a library emergency." "June says you owe her for a pipe burst." Marianne closed her eyes for half a second. "That woman has no respect for archival boundaries." "But she has a good memory." "She has a dangerous memory. There is a difference." Still, she stood. Bishop followed Caleb past the reading tables and down a narrow stairway behind a door marked "Staff Only." The basement was colder than the main floor and smelled of dust, cardboard, aging glue, and furnace heat. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Along the walls stood metal shelves filled with boxes, rolled maps, ledger books, and bound volumes of newspapers whose spines had cracked with age. Marianne handed Caleb a pair of cotton gloves. "Do not lick your fingers to turn pages." "I wasn't planning to." People never plan to commit archival crimes. They simply become impatient. Her sharpness carried less fear today. That mattered. She led him to a microfilm reader tucked beneath a low ceiling beam. Newspaper index first. Town council minutes after, if we have reason. Business correspondence is incomplete. Some of it was transferred to county storage. Some of it was probably thrown out by men who thought filing cabinets were a feminine conspiracy. Caleb sat at the machine. Bishop settled beneath the table, positioning himself where he could see the stairs. Marianne loaded the first reel. Silverpine Gazette, winter through spring, 33 years earlier. The past appeared in pale gray columns. At first, the articles were full of anticipation. Railroad expansion could bring new life to Valley. North Freight proposal moves forward. Local businesses prepare for growth. Caleb read names, dates, projections, quotes from council members, interviews with shop owners who had already ordered supplies they could not yet afford. Hope had a particular tone in print, bold, practical, slightly desperate. Then the language changed. Delay raises questions about depot clearance. Safety objection threatens freight agreement. Signal coordinator refuses final schedule approval. Marianne stood behind him, arms crossed tightly. Caleb slowed. There were no accusations in the earliest articles. Not yet. The paper described Mabel Corwin as a senior signal coordinator requesting additional review of operating conditions through North Ravine. A councilman urged patience. A business owner warned delays could jeopardize the agreement. A railroad representative declined comment. Then, 2 weeks later, the editorial appeared. Caleb read the headline twice. "Fear cannot feed a town." The piece did not call Mabel by her first name. It did not need to. It described one employee's unelected caution and the cruelty of hesitation in a community already struggling to survive. It accused no one directly while teaching everyone where to aim their anger. Marianne leaned closer, her face pale in the glow of the screen. "I have seen that headline before," she said. "Recently?" "No, always. In pieces. People quote it without knowing they are quoting it." Caleb scrolled down. A line near the middle stopped him. "When private fear is given power over public bread, an entire town is made hostage to one woman's trembling hand." He sat back. The room seemed colder. Marianne whispered, "That is obscene." "Yes." "I cataloged this reel 15 years ago." Caleb looked at her. She removed her glasses, then put them back on without cleaning them. "I cataloged it. I never read past the headlines." "That isn't the same as writing it." "No," she said. "It is not the same. But it is not nothing either." The words hung there, heavier than accusation would have been. Caleb continued reading. After the editorial, the articles changed. No one needed proof anymore. The paper began referring to the failed project as the Corwin delay. A hotel renovation was canceled. A hardware supplier withdrew. A diner owner laid off 3 workers. A freight company chose an alternate route through New Hampshire. By summer, the language had hardened into memory. Marianne brought another reel with hands that moved more slowly now. "Try late March," she said. "The snowpack reports would be around then, if there was any weather event." There was. How do you know? Mabel watches weather like some people watch scripture. The faintest smile moved across Marianne's mouth, then vanished. They searched. For 20 minutes, there was nothing but church suppers, tax notices, a collapsed barn roof, a flu outbreak among adults at the mill, advertisements for snow tires. Then Marianne leaned over Caleb's shoulder and tapped the screen. There. It was a small item, not even on the front page. Minor slide reported at North Ravine. Caleb adjusted the focus. The article stated that a late-season wet snowslide had come down along the east wall of North Ravine during the night. The affected railbed, no longer in active use, had suffered partial burial and rock debris. There were no injuries. No freight was scheduled. Crews from the county assessed the area and found no immediate threat to town roads. That was all. 6 sentences. No photograph. No follow-up article. No connection to the canceled freight route. Marianne read it aloud once, then again, slower. No injuries, she said. Caleb stared at the screen. Because no one was there. The simple truth landed with such force that neither of them spoke. That was the shape of Mabel's punishment. The town remembered everything visible, the shuttered shops, the empty platforms, the men coming home without wages, the families who left after Christmas and did not return. But the thing Mabel may have prevented had left almost nothing behind. No black-bordered photographs, no funerals, no names carved into stone, no widows standing in snow beside coffins. The absence had no witnesses. Caleb felt Bishop's head press briefly against his knee under the table. He looked down. The dog was watching him, steady, amber-eyed, aware not of the article, but of the pressure building inside the man reading it. Caleb placed one hand on Bishop's head. "I'm all right," he said softly. Marianne heard him, but did not pretend the words were meant for her. By noon, they had gathered photocopies of the editorial, the project timeline, the safety objection references, and the North Ravine slide report. None of it was enough by itself. That frustrated Caleb, though he knew better than to expect truth to arrive in one clean file. Marianne spread the pages across a table in the basement. This proves the slide happened. It proves Mrs. Corwin objected. It proves the paper helped turn public anger toward her. It doesn't prove she was right. No. It proves they were cruel. Yes. Cruelty isn't technical evidence. Marianne looked at the old map cabinet against the wall. There may be a way to get closer. She crossed the room, opened a drawer, and searched through a set of index cards bound with a rubber band so old it cracked when she touched it. After several minutes, she pulled one free. "Warren Ellery," she said. "Who is that?" Dr. Warren Ellery, geological consultant. He reviewed slope stability for several state projects in the 80s and 90s. His name appears on a county survey reference connected to North Ravine. She read the card. He retired to Grafton Notch. That's 40 minutes east if the roads are clear. He's still alive? Marianne gave him a look. He returned a library book last month with a 6-page note correcting the author's misuse of the word moraine. Yes, he is alive. An hour later, Caleb and Bishop were driving east through a valley road where snowbanks rose on both sides and the mountains pressed close enough to make the sky seem narrow. Marianne had called ahead, speaking in her careful librarian voice until, after several long silences, she handed Caleb the phone. "He wants to know if you are sentimental or stupid." "What did you tell him?" "That I did not know you well enough to distinguish." Dr. Warren Ellery lived in a house that looked less built than assembled from stubbornness. Cedar siding, a metal roof, stacks of firewood, and surveying poles leaning beside the porch. Maps filled the front windows. A pair of snowshoes hung beside the door under a sign that read, "Ring once. Wait, I heard you." Caleb rang once. The man who opened the door was lean, weathered, and irritated before anyone had given him reason. Warren Ellery had uncombed white hair, several days of gray stubble, and eyes the hard blue of winter shade. He wore a stone-gray sweater under a faded green vest, hiking pants, and wool socks inside unlaced boots. He looked at Caleb, then Bishop, then the folder in Caleb's hand.
If this is about property development, I charge triple for moral emergencies.
It's about North Ravine. Warren's expression changed, not softened, focused. Come in. His living room had surrendered to paper decades ago. Topographical maps covered the tables. Rolled surveys stood in bins. Rock samples occupied a windowsill. A wood stove burned hot enough to make Caleb remove his jacket. Bishop settled near the door without being told. Warren spread the old map across a drafting table and weighted it with stones. "Who gave you this?" "Silverpine Library." "Of course. They bury the useful things in places no one with authority bothers to visit." Caleb placed the copied article beside the map. Mabel Corwin refused clearance for winter freight through this route. The town blamed her when the expansion failed. A slide happened here months later. Warren bent over the map. For several minutes, he said nothing. That silence did more to convince Caleb than any immediate reaction would have. At last, Warren tapped North Ravine with one blunt finger. "Bad passage." "Why?" "East wall catches meltwater behind fractured rock. Snow loads unevenly because wind funnels through the notch. Late winter sun hits the upper shelf, weakens the bond. Then the temperature drops again, and people think it's stable because it looks frozen." He glanced up. "It is not stable. It is waiting." "You reviewed this at the time?" "I reviewed a preliminary county survey, not the railroad's final submission. I remember being annoyed by the language." "What language?" "Soft language. Administrative language. Words designed to make danger sound like a scheduling concern." Warren crossed the room, pulled a binder from a shelf, and returned with surprising speed for a man of 64. "Here. Slope movement noted. Additional monitoring recommended. Not prohibited. Not unsafe. Recommended." That word has killed more people than avalanches. Caleb read the copied page. "So Mabel was right." Warren's eyes narrowed. "Do not turn engineering into church." Caleb looked up. "Right is for hymns and campaign speeches," Warren said. "Responsible is the word you want. Based on the available information, refusing to certify a heavy winter freight schedule through that ravine without further review was responsible. Could people have died? People can die crossing a parking lot. That isn't an answer. It is the honest one." Warren tapped the map again. "A loaded freight line through there, in a bad thaw-freeze cycle, with crews working under schedule pressure? Yes. A serious incident was plausible. More than plausible if maintenance reports were as optimistic as these notes suggest." Caleb absorbed that. Not certainty, not vindication clean enough for a statue, but enough. Enough to know Mabel had not been hysterical. Enough to know Silverpine had built its hatred on a refusal that had, at minimum, been grounded in real danger. Warren looked toward Bishop, who had lifted his head. "Dog understands," Warren said. "Understands what?" "That humans prefer tragedy with bodies. Easier to count." No one spoke for a while after that. The drive back to Silverpine felt shorter and heavier. Caleb carried copies of Warren's notes. his written statement, and an invitation to call if the council begins lying with confidence. Outside the truck windows, the winter woods blurred past in bands of black and white. By the time Caleb reached town, dusk had begun to gather. He did not go to Mabel first. He went to Elias Benton. The old man opened the door after the first knock this time, as if he had been standing near it. "You came back," Elias said. "Yes. I figured you would." "Why?" Elias looked past him at the road, then at Bishop. "Because Mrs. Corwin always did attract the kind of trouble that stands politely before it enters." Caleb held up the folder. "I spoke to Warren Ellery." Elias closed his eyes. The reaction told Caleb more than surprise would have. "You know that name." "I know a lot of names I pretend not to." "Then stop pretending." For a moment, Caleb thought Elias would shut the door again. Instead, the old man stepped aside. The house smelled of stove heat, dust, and old wool. Elias led him into a small sitting room where a conductor's cap hung on the wall and a stopped pocket watch lay on the mantel. Bishop remained near Caleb but did not settle. The room felt too full of things unsaid. Elias lowered himself into a chair. "I heard the engineers arguing," he said before Caleb asked. "Not everything. Enough." "When?" "Before the contract died. 2 men from the company came through. One of them said the ravine needed another look. The other said another look would cost them the season." Did Mabel know? She knew something was wrong. She asked questions. Too many for men who had already spent the money in their heads. "Why didn't you say anything?" Elias looked at his hands. They trembled slightly, resting on his knees. "Because when the deal fell apart, my life fell with it." The room was very still. "My job went first, then my marriage, then most of the man I had been. People think shame makes you noble if you suffer long enough. It doesn't. Sometimes it just makes you hungry for someone else to be guilty." Caleb said nothing. Elias looked toward the window where the last light lay blue on the snow. "I let them say her name because it was easier than saying mine. Easier than saying we all wanted that contract so badly we stopped caring what it asked us not to see." He swallowed. "I knew she had reason. I did not know she was right. That distinction helped me sleep for a while." "And now?" Elias gave a small, broken laugh. "Now I sleep badly." Caleb opened the folder but did not hand it over. Not yet. "She never asked me to clear her name," he said. "No," Elias whispered. "She wouldn't." "Why?" "Because she knows this town." He looked up at Caleb then, eyes wet but not weeping. "And because there are lies people tell because they are cruel." His voice thinned. "And there are lies people tell so they can get out of bed in the morning." Caleb held the old man's gaze. Outside, Silverpine's festival lights blinked awake one by one, bright against the snow. Lovely enough to make a stranger believe the town had nothing to hide. By the next morning, Silverpine knew Caleb Whitaker had been in the library basement. No one had seen him carry the old newspaper copies out, but that did not matter. In a town like Silverpine, facts traveled slowly, and suspicion traveled dressed for the weather. By breakfast, June Callahan had already heard that Caleb was digging through council papers. By noon, someone had told the postmaster he was trying to ruin the depot vote. By 2 o'clock, a man at the general store said Caleb had come back to town because Mabel Corwin had hired him. "She didn't hire me," Caleb told June when she repeated it. June stood behind the front desk of Callahan House, folding towels that were already folded. The lobby fire burned too hot, and the windows had gone white at the edges with frost. She wore her usual apron, but the cheer had drained from her face. "I know that," she said, "but knowing things doesn't make people quieter."
Bishop lay near the hearth, his head resting on his paws, eyes half open.
"People asking you questions?" Caleb asked. "People ask me questions when a stranger sneezes. This is more than questions." June pressed a towel flat with both hands. "Mrs. Braddock canceled her room for the festival weekend. Said she didn't want to stay where trouble was being hosted." "I can find another place." June looked offended before she looked afraid. "Don't be foolish. I didn't say that." "You're worried." "I run a house with 7 guest rooms in a town that survives on 2 good months and the mercy of people who like snow." Her voice sharpened, then softened. "Yes, Caleb, I'm worried." He accepted that. Worry, at least, was honest. June glanced toward the front windows. Across the square, the depot sat under a bright winter sky, its brick walls beautiful enough to sell and old enough to abandon. "I don't hate her," she said. "Mabel?" "Who else would I mean?" June's mouth tightened. "I don't hate her, but I have spent 30 years knowing which conversations not to enter. That becomes a kind of skill." "Or a habit." She looked at him then. The words had landed harder than he intended, but he did not take them back. June folded another towel, slower this time. "Be careful with Marianne. She isn't built for being disliked." "No one is." "Mabel is." "No," Caleb said. "She has just had practice." June looked away first. At 3, Caleb walked to the library with Bishop beside him and the folder of copied records under one arm. The wind had risen, pushing loose snow across the street in thin white ribbons. The festival decorations still hung over Main Street, but now they seemed almost embarrassed by their own brightness. Marianne was not at the front desk. A handwritten sign read, "Back in 10 minutes," though the ink had dried long ago. Caleb found her in the rear office, standing over a stack of boxes, her cardigan sleeves pushed to her elbows, and several loose strands of hair falling from her bun. She looked less like a librarian guarding order than a woman trying to hold back a flood with catalog labels. "They know," she said before he could speak. "Yes." Graham's office called, twice, asked whether any council documents had been released without authorization. "Had they?" "No, not yet." Marianne removed her glasses, then immediately put them back on. "The newspapers are public. The slide report was public. Warren's statement is his own. But council minutes are different." "Can you access them?" "I can request them." "Will they give them to you?" "They may delay, or misplace, or ask why the library suddenly cares about a meeting from 3 decades ago." She touched a box with 2 fingers. "The funny thing is, I should have cared all along." Before Caleb could answer, the front door opened hard enough for the bell to strike twice. "Where is he?" Nora Pike's voice carried through the library without rising. Marianne closed her eyes. "Oh, good. It's becoming theatrical." Nora appeared in the office doorway with snow on her boots and anger in every line of her body. She wore a brown Sherpa jacket over a denim shirt, and her hands were bare despite the cold, red at the knuckles, scarred from work. Her eyes went first to Caleb, then to the folder in his hand. "You showing people papers now?" she asked. "Only people willing to read them." "That's supposed to be clever?" "No." "Good, because I'm not in the mood for clever." Bishop stood, but Caleb gave no command. The dog moved to Caleb's side and remained there. Marianne stepped forward. Nora, this is a public building, and I'm the public. You are also loud. I've earned loud. Caleb set the folder on the desk. You came to say something. Say it. Nora's gaze flicked toward the documents as if they were alive and offensive. You don't get to arrive here after 30 years and decide our grief was filed incorrectly. No one said it was. You think because you found some article and some old rock man with a map, we're all supposed to line up and apologize to Mrs. Corwin? No. You sure? That's how this kind of thing usually goes. Stranger comes in, tells the town it's rotten, finds a sad old woman, turns her into a saint, and leaves before the roads get muddy. The accusation hit close enough that Caleb did not answer quickly. Marianne looked at him. Nora saw the pause and pressed harder. My father worked that line 17 years. He knew every switch, every tie, every frozen bolt. When the expansion died, he told my mother it would be fine because a man who has worked all his life believes work will find him if he waits in the right place. Her jaw tightened. It didn't. He broke by inches, Mr. Whitaker. Not in one dramatic scene people can write songs about. Inches. The library seemed to shrink around her voice. Paper didn't feed him. Paper didn't keep my mother from selling our house. Paper didn't stop him from drinking in the shed because he was ashamed for us to see him do it in the kitchen. Caleb opened the folder and took out the North Ravine slide report, the editorial, and Warren Ellery's statement. He placed them on the desk between them. No, he said. Paper didn't save your father. Nora's nostrils flared, ready for condescension. Caleb did not give her any. It also didn't do those things to him. Her eyes hardened. Don't. I'm not saying your pain isn't real. You don't know my pain. No, I know what men do when shame hollows them out. I know what families do when they need one name to hang the whole storm on. Caleb tapped the editorial. This gave Silverpine a name. Nora looked at the headline but did not touch the page. Fear cannot feed a town. Something moved in her expression then. Not doubt, not yet, but recognition. As if she had heard those words all her life in other mouths. My father kept that paper, she said quietly. Caleb waited. In a drawer under his socks. I found it after he died. She swallowed. I thought he kept it because it explained what happened to him. Maybe he did. Maybe he needed it to. That was when Bishop moved. Nora had stepped forward without realizing it. Caleb had done the same. Neither was shouting, but their bodies had begun speaking in the old language of confrontation. Weight forward, shoulders set, hurt sharpening into defense. Bishop walked between them and sat down, not facing Nora, not guarding Caleb, simply placing his body in the narrow strip of space where the next word might have become a wound. The library fell silent. Nora looked down at the dog. Bishop looked at no one. His ears were relaxed, his breathing steady, his scarred left ear tipped slightly outward. After a long moment, Nora gave a small, bitter laugh. Well, she said, voice rough, even the dog thinks we're fools. Caleb let out a breath he had not known he was holding. He thinks we're getting close to saying something we can't unsay. Nora's face changed again. This time, the anger did not vanish. It lost its certainty. She reached down, not toward Bishop's head, but toward the side of his neck. Then she stopped halfway, remembering herself or remembering something older. Bishop leaned forward just enough to meet her hand. Nora closed her fingers briefly in his fur. My father's shepherd waited by the door after he stopped coming home on time, she said. Dog knew before we did. Knew what? That he was lost while still walking around. No one in the room moved. Then Nora pulled her hand back, looked at the documents once more, and said, "I'm not ready to forgive her." "No one asked you to." "I'm not ready to say we were wrong." Caleb nodded. Nora pointed at the folder. "But if you're going to use paper, use all of it, not just the parts that make your side feel clean." Then she turned and left the library. The bell struck once behind her. Mary Ann sat down slowly at the nearest chair. "That was not a victory." "No," Caleb said. "It was better than one." Later that afternoon, Mary Ann sent Caleb to see Reverend Paul Redding. "He won't come to you," she said, "but if you ask directly, he may answer directly. He is old-fashioned that way." "Is he still the town minister?" "Retired, officially. Unofficially, people still confess to him at the grocery store." Paul Redding lived in a modest parsonage behind the white church, though he no longer preached there. Caleb found him stacking firewood beneath a lean-to, his gray coat dusted with snow, his white beard trimmed close, his hands still strong despite his age. At 66, he had the calm posture of a man who had spent years listening to others suffer and had not always known what to do with the burden. He recognized Caleb before Caleb introduced himself. "Mrs. Corwin's soldier," Paul said. "I'm not hers." "No," Paul replied, placing another log on the stack. "But people assign ownership when they are frightened. It makes loyalties easier to condemn." Caleb liked him less for how quickly he understood. They went inside, where the former reverend poured coffee so weak it barely deserved the name. The room held theology books, old hymnals, and a photograph of Paul as a young minister standing beside the town hall, his face smooth with certainty he no longer possessed. "You were at the meeting," Caleb said. Paul looked down at his cup. "Yes." "When Mabel tried to explain?" "Yes." "What happened?" "What Mrs. Corwin told you, I imagine." "I want to hear what you did." Paul smiled sadly. "That is a more Christian question than most Christians ask." He did not answer immediately. Outside the window, the church bell tower cut a dark shape against a white sky. "I had been in Silverpine less than a year," Paul said. "Young, eager, intoxicated by being needed. The town was frightened. Men were losing work. Families were already planning to leave. When Mrs. Corwin stood up with her notes, the room did not want caution. It wanted rescue." "And Voss's father?" Everett Voss knew how to give a crowd permission. Paul's mouth tightened. He did not need to tell them to despise her. He only made it respectable. "What did you do?" Paul looked at him then. "Nothing." The word landed without decoration. "I told myself I was preserving peace, that if I challenged the room, I would lose the trust of the people I had been called to serve. I told myself a pastor must be patient with anger." His voice thinned. "But patience without courage is just fear with better manners." Caleb said nothing. Paul rubbed his thumb along the chipped edge of his cup. "My sin was not that I hated her. I did not. My sin was that I watched her be hated and called my silence wisdom." The sentence remained in the air long after he spoke it. Caleb knew many kinds of confession. Some men confessed to reduce their punishment, some to arrange themselves more favorably in memory. Paul Redding confessed like a man who had spent years sanding down excuses until only the plain wood remained. "Will you say that publicly?" Caleb asked. Paul closed his eyes. There it was, the cost. "I do not know," he said. "At least that's honest." "No," Paul replied.
It is preliminary. By the time Caleb reached the town hall, the sky had gone dark blue, and the windows of Graham Voss's office glowed above the square. The building was old brick with a newer glass entrance, an architectural compromise that made neither past nor present look entirely comfortable.
Graham's assistant had gone for the day. The office door stood open. Graham sat behind a wide desk, clean enough to suggest either discipline or concealment. Behind him, tall windows looked down on the depot. On the wall hung framed development sketches, the depot restored with warm lights, a boutique hotel wing behind it, skiers laughing near outdoor fire pits, tasteful signs promising heritage luxury in the heart of Vermont. "Mr. Whitaker," Graham said, "you're becoming a very busy visitor." Caleb stepped inside. Bishop remained at his heel. "I've been talking to people." "So I hear." Nora Pike left the library looking as if she wanted to break something useful. She didn't. That is a mercy. Her work is excellent. Graham gestured to a chair. Caleb did not sit. "I spoke to Warren Ellery," Caleb said. Graham's expression barely changed, but his right hand moved to adjust his cuff. "Warren Ellery has disliked every development proposal in the state since 1984. He says Mabel's refusal was responsible." "He would." "He also says the danger at North Ravine was real." Graham leaned back slowly. For the first time, his polish did not feel false to Caleb. It felt defensive, carefully built, carefully maintained. "You think that solves something," Graham said. "I think it changes what your town has been saying about her." "My town?" Graham's voice sharpened. "You are staying in a rented room, Mr. Whitaker. You have the luxury of moral clarity because you do not have to keep anyone employed after the festival ends." Caleb held his gaze. Graham stood and moved to the window. Below, the depot's yellow light burned in the waiting room. "Do you know how many storefronts on Main Street are profitable in March?" Graham asked. "Not charming, not beloved, profitable." "No." 4, maybe 5 in a good year. The bakery survives because the owner's sister wires money from Boston. The hardware store is leveraged past decency. June's house is full in winter and limping by May. Nora repairs saddles for ranches 2 counties over because local work isn't enough. People sell crafts to tourists and call it resilience because poverty sounds ugly. He turned. North Star is not a fantasy. It is a contract. Jobs, tax revenue, road repair, heat in public buildings without 3 fundraisers and a prayer. I'm not against work. No, you are for memory. That is cheaper. Caleb absorbed the blow without answering. Graham continued, softer now. My father believed the rail expansion would save this town. He died believing one woman's fear cost us that future. And if he was wrong? Then he was wrong. Graham's jaw tightened. But wrong does not reopen stores. Wrong does not bring back families. Wrong does not pay the mortgage of a town that has been dying politely for 30 years. Caleb looked at the development sketches again. They were tasteful, convincing, almost kind. You may be right about needing the project, Caleb said. That surprised Graham. But if you build it on a lie, Caleb continued, Silverpine won't be healed. It will only be renovated. Graham's eyes hardened. Careful. That is a kind of sentence outsiders mistake for wisdom. And this is the kind of office where men mistake paperwork for conscience. For a moment, neither moved. Bishop did not step forward. He did not need to. The room itself had become the line between them. At last, Graham returned to his desk. The vote will proceed, he said. I know. And Mrs. Corwin will return the keys if the council requires it.
Maybe. Graham looked up. Maybe? Caleb's voice stayed quiet. Keys are simple. What she remembers is not. He left before Graham could answer. Snow had begun again when Caleb returned to the library. He found Mary Ann in the basement, surrounded by 3 open boxes and a cloud of dust.
Her cheeks were flushed, and her hair had fallen almost entirely loose from its clip. "I found it," she said. Her voice was not triumphant. It was shaken. She held out a photocopy of a council meeting summary dated 2 weeks before Mabel's refusal became public controversy. Caleb read the paragraph once, then slower. A county safety recommendation had been entered into the record. It advised additional review of North Ravine before expanded winter freight scheduling. In the next page's summary, the issue had been reclassified as personal operational concern raised by station signal staff. Personal, operational, concern. Not geological risk, not safety recommendation, not independent review. Mabel had been shrunk into the problem. Caleb lowered the page. Mary Ann's eyes were bright behind her glasses. "This isn't criminal proof." "No." "It won't make people suddenly kind." "No." "But she didn't invent it." Caleb looked at the paper again. "No," he said. "They made her carry it." Above them, somewhere in the library, the radiator knocked in the wall like an old building trying to speak. By dusk, the storm had erased the mountains. Silverpine was used to snow. It knew the difference between weather that decorated roofs and weather that meant business. By 4 in the afternoon, shopkeepers had pulled in their sandwich boards. The bakery had taped a handwritten, "Closed early" sign to the door, and the festival lights strung across Main Street swung wildly in the wind, blinking through veils of white. The vote on the depot property was scheduled for the following evening. Everyone in town knew it. No one said it casually now. At Callahan House, June moved from window to window, checking latches with the impatience of a woman who did not trust old wood or old arguments. The radio behind the front desk crackled with a weather advisory. Bishop lay near the fireplace, but he had not settled fully. His head lifted whenever the wind struck the side of the house. Caleb stood in the lobby, watching snow push sideways across the street. "You're thinking about going out," June said. "I'm looking out a window." "I run an inn. Men who are just looking out windows don't put on boots." Caleb glanced down. His boots were already laced. June came beside him and followed his gaze toward the far end of the square. Through the blowing snow, the depot was barely visible, a dark shape under a whitening roof. One yellow light burned inside. June's face changed. "She went there," Caleb said. "Of course she did." June's voice held irritation, but underneath it was fear. "That west roof panel leaks during normal snow. In this wind..." "She told anyone?" "Mabel Corwin does not send invitations to be worried over." Caleb reached for his field jacket. Bishop was already standing. June looked from the dog to Caleb. "You can't stop the roof from being old." "No, but I can keep her from being alone under it." June's hand tightened around the towel she had been folding. For a second, she looked like she wanted to say the practical thing. "Roads are bad. Wait until morning. Don't make trouble worse." Instead, she turned abruptly toward the desk phone. "I'll call Mary Ann." Caleb paused at the door. June did not look at him as she dialed. "Don't give me that face. I'm not coming with you. Someone has to stay here and pretend to be sensible." Outside, the cold struck hard enough to steal the first breath. Caleb leaned into the wind, Bishop beside him, both of them moving through snow, that had already filled the footprints of the hour before. Main Street had lost its postcard shine. The garlands whipped against the lampposts. A loose strand of festival lights snapped and sparked once before going dark. The town looked less festive now, more honest. Wood, brick, ice, and things that needed repair. The depot door was unlocked. Inside, the waiting room glowed dimly beneath the single yellow bulb. The old benches stood in rows, their varnish dulled by age. Buckets had been placed along the west wall, where water dripped from a seam near the glass roof panel. The wind pressed against the building and made the windows tremble in their frames. Mabel stood on a low step stool beneath the west side of the ceiling, tying a strip of cloth around the handle of a bucket so it could hang from a pipe. "Get down," Caleb said. She did not turn. "Good evening to you too." "You're standing under old glass in a storm." "I have been standing under old glass longer than you've been worrying about it." Bishop moved past Caleb and stopped beside the stool. He did not bark. He only looked up at Mabel with such steady disapproval that she sighed. "Oh, don't recruit the dog." Caleb crossed the room and took the bucket from her hand. Mabel gave it up, but only because letting him take it cost less than arguing on a stool. She stepped down slowly. Snowmelt had darkened the hem of her coat, and her scarf was dusted white near the shoulders. Her cheeks were pale, but her eyes were alert. "You knew this section was bad," Caleb said. "I know every section that is bad." "Well, then why come?" "Because by morning, Graham will have photographs." She looked up at the glass. "Water on the floor, snow through the roof. He will stand in front of the council and call it proof that the depot is beyond saving." "Well, it may need saving from the roof before it needs saving from Graham." Mabel's mouth tightened, but she did not deny it. That was the first honest thing the storm gave them. Caleb set to work without asking permission again. He moved buckets, dragged one of the benches away from the danger area, and wedged an old wooden broom beneath a rattling side door. Bishop made slow circuits of the waiting room, returning often to Mabel, then to Caleb, then to the door. After 20 minutes, the depot no longer sounded empty. The front door opened with a blast of snow, and Marianne Holt stumbled in, wearing a heavy coat, a mustard scarf wrapped up to her chin, and white archival gloves entirely unsuited for weather. She was followed by Reverend Paul Redding, who carried a flashlight and looked as though he had argued with himself all the way across town, and lost. June had done more than call one person. Elias Benton arrived last among them, bent against the wind, one hand clamped over his old tweed cap. He stepped inside and stopped, as if entering the depot required permission from every version of himself that had once worked there. Mabel stared at them. "What is this?" she asked. Marianne pushed wet hair out of her face. "A poor decision made collectively." Paul lifted the flashlight. "June said you might need help." "I need people to stop treating this building like a corpse before it has died." Elias looked up at the ceiling. His voice came out thin. "West panel always did complain in weather." Mabel turned toward him. For a moment, the years stood between them so visibly that Caleb almost looked away. Elias did not apologize. Mabel did not invite him to. But he walked to the storage closet, took out another bucket without asking where it was, and placed it beneath a new drip. That, too, was an honest thing. They worked in an awkward rhythm. Marianne sorted old papers off a window ledge and moved them away from damp. Paul held a flashlight while Caleb tied a tarp beneath the worst seam. Elias found a stack of wooden braces in a side room and knew which ones were still strong enough to use. Mabel supervised with the merciless precision of someone who believed gratitude was no excuse for stupidity. "No, not there," she told Paul. "That beam is decorative now. It retired before you did."
Paul blinked, then moved the flashlight. "I stand corrected."
"You usually sat corrected, as I recall."
A brief silence followed. Then Elias laughed once. A small, startled sound.
Marianne looked down quickly, hiding a smile. The depot breathed differently after that. Not healed, not forgiven, but occupied. Caleb was securing the tarp when another set of headlights moved across the frosted windows. Bishop stopped mid-step. The front door opened, and Graham Voss entered with two people behind him. A town council clerk named Allison Greer, gray-haired and severe beneath a plastic rain hood, and a man in an expensive storm coat Caleb recognized from the development sketches as someone who did not belong to Silverpine. The stranger had a smooth, wind-burned face, leather gloves too clean for the night, and the guarded politeness of a person trained to calculate damage in dollars before speaking. Graham brushed snow from his sleeves. His dark parka looked practical and costly, but his polished boots were already wet at the seams. "Mabel," he said, then caught himself. "Mrs. Corwin, what is going on here?" Mabel stood near the ticket window, one hand on the broom handle like a staff. "Maintenance. The building is not open for unsupervised repairs. Then it is fortunate you have arrived to supervise." Allison Greer looked at the buckets, the tarp, the old benches pulled aside. "This is exactly the concern, Graham. Liability." The man from North Star said nothing, but his eyes traveled to the ceiling. Graham's expression tightened. "Mr. Layton is here to complete a pre-vote site assessment." "During a storm?" Caleb asked. Graham glanced at him. "Storms reveal weaknesses. So do votes." Mabel shot Caleb a look that meant she did not need him making decorative trouble. Graham walked farther into the room. "This is not sustainable. Look around. The roof leaks. The electrical system is decades beyond efficient. The town cannot keep pouring sentiment into a structure that produces nothing." Mabel's reply came quietly. "This place has produced more honesty than your office has this week." The words struck. Even Paul looked down. Graham's voice cooled. "Silverpine cannot live forever inside your grievance. And I cannot allow Silverpine to call demolition healing." Mr. Layton finally spoke. "No one is talking about demolition in the crude sense. Adaptive reuse can preserve historic character while allowing economic productivity." Mabel looked at him. "That is a beautiful sentence. Did someone pay you by the syllable?" Marianne made a sound that might have been a cough. Graham stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You are not the only person who suffered, Mabel." For the first time that night, he used her name without correcting it. She noticed. So did Caleb. "No," Mabel said. "I am not. That is exactly what I have been trying to say for 30 years. The wind struck the west wall with a sudden violence that made every window shudder. Above them, the glass panel gave a sharp, delicate crack. Everyone looked up. For one suspended second, nothing moved. Then, a narrow section near the west seam split further, with a sound like ice breaking on a pond. Snow and tiny shards of glass spilled down over the row of benches Mabel had been standing near earlier. Bishop moved first. He lunged, not toward the falling glass, but toward Mabel, driving his shoulder into her leg with enough force to push her backward. Caleb caught her arm as she stumbled. A spray of snow and bright fragments struck the floor where she had been. "Back!" Caleb shouted. Bishop barked once, loud and commanding, then planted himself between the group and the west side of the room. The front door blew open. Wind tore through the depot, snatching papers from Marianne's hands, knocking one bucket sideways, sending icy air spinning through the waiting room. The yellow bulb swung overhead. Caleb and Graham reached the door at the same time. For one instant, they did not look at each other. They simply acted. Caleb drove his shoulder into the wood from one side. Graham grabbed the iron handle and pulled hard from the other. The wind fought them like a living thing. Paul braced the bottom with his boot. Elias moved faster than Caleb would have expected from the old man, limping toward the sidewall. "Power!" Elias shouted. "Kill the auxiliary before water reaches that outlet." "I know where it is," Mabel said. "You're not going," Caleb snapped. Elias was already at the panel near the old ticket booth, fingers trembling but certain. He opened the metal cover and pulled the switch. The waiting room dropped into partial darkness, leaving only flashlights and the storm-gray glow from the windows. Marianne guided Mabel toward the inner hallway, one arm firm around her shoulders. Mabel resisted for half a step, then stopped. Not because she was weak, because Bishop had turned and fixed her with a look even she seemed unwilling to argue with. "Fine," she muttered. "But if that tarp comes loose, I will haunt all of you while still alive." The crisis lasted less than 5 minutes. No ceiling collapsed. No one bled except Graham, who had cut the side of his hand on the door latch and tried to hide it until June arrived with a first aid kit and the fury of someone who had decided being sensible was no longer useful. "You called half the town," Mabel said when she saw her. June pulled gauze from the kit. "Only the half that answers phones." "You should have stayed at the house." "And missed this display of collective incompetence? Never." The remark was sharp, but June's hands shook as she wrapped Graham's cut. The depot settled into a cold, uneasy quiet. The west benches were dusted with snow and glittering glass. The tarp held poorly, but held. Flashlights lay across the floor in pale bars. Everyone's breath showed in the air now that the door had let so much cold inside. Graham looked at the damaged roof, then at Mabel. "This proves my point," he said, though there was less force behind it than before. "Yes," Mabel said. The answer surprised him. She walked slowly to the center of the waiting room. Bishop stayed close, his shoulder brushing her coat. She did not lean on him, but she did not move away either. "This building is failing," she said. "I know that better than any of you. I have emptied buckets beneath it for years. I have patched windows with tape and prayer and stubbornness. I have kept mice from eating records no one asked to read. I have watched paint peel in rooms where men once promised the future." She turned toward Graham. "So do not tell me I want a museum to my own pain. I do not." The room was still. Mabel looked at the broken glass, then at the ticket window, the benches, the darkened clock, the map of old routes fading on the wall. "I do not oppose work. I do not oppose visitors. I do not oppose this town eating through winter." Her voice held steady. "I oppose a future that requires everyone to keep calling me a traitor so they can feel clean while building it." Graham said nothing. Caleb watched him closely. The man's face had not softened, but it had changed. The storm had taken some of the polish from him. His hair was damp, his hand bandaged, his boots ruined. And for once, he looked less like a chairman than a tired man standing in a building older than his certainty. "What do you want?" Graham asked. No one seemed to breathe. Mabel looked almost annoyed by the question, as if she had been waiting decades for someone to ask it, and resented how late it had arrived. "A third thing," she said. Mr. Layton frowned. "A third thing?" Not this building pickled in nostalgia. Not this building swallowed whole by luxury. Mabel lifted one hand toward the waiting room. A winter station. Marianne's eyes sharpened. Mabel continued. A place open on storm nights. Heat, coffee, blankets. A room for people passing through who have nowhere warm to wait. Veterans, seasonal workers, old men too proud to say their furnace failed, women who do not want to explain why they cannot go home yet. Anyone the weather finds before kindness does. The words entered the room differently than argument. Even Nora, who had appeared silently in the doorway sometime after June and now stood with snow across her shoulders, did not interrupt. Mabel pointed toward the East office. That room becomes an archive, the real history. The railroad, the expansion, the failure, the slide, the mistakes. Mine included if you can find them. Yours too, if you can bear it. And money? Allison Greer asked, practical even in the cold. The rear lot, Mabel said. Lease it, carefully, not sell, lease. Let North Star build something smaller there if it must. Use the revenue for repairs and heat. Put the depot in a trust so no one man's ambition can trade it away again. Marianne looked at Graham. That is structurally possible. Graham's eyes moved to her. You've thought about this? Marianne held his gaze. For about 30 seconds, which is apparently more time than anyone gave the truth 30 years ago. Paul Redding made a quiet sound that might have been agreement. Graham looked at Mabel again. The storm battered the walls. Snow continued to fall through the broken seam in soft, harmless drifts now that everyone stood clear of it. The depot, damaged and cold, seemed less like an artifact than a question. Mr. Layton cleared his throat. North Star would need to revise projections. Then revise them, Graham said. The room turned toward him. His jaw tightened, as if he regretted speaking before he had arranged his face around the words. He looked at Mabel for a long time. Not at Mrs. Corwin, at Mabel. This does not change tomorrow's vote, he said. No, she replied. It complicates it. Most true things do. The smallest, strangest smile touched his mouth and vanished before it could become warmth. Mabel, he said, and this time he did not correct himself. You should not be standing under that roof. Mabel looked up at the cracked glass, then down at Bishop, who had planted himself firmly beside her. For once, she said, we agree. No apology followed. No forgiveness arrived. But the name remained in the room after he spoke it, fragile and unmistakable, like the first clear pane left unbroken after a storm. The vote was held in the library because the town hall meeting room still smelled of wet coats, old heat, and arguments that had outgrown it. By 6 that evening, every chair Marianne Holt could find had been carried into the main reading room. Folding chairs filled the aisles between shelves. The children's corner had been closed off, not because there were children present, but because no one wanted adults standing awkwardly among picture books while deciding what kind of town they had been. Coffee sat in 2 metal urns near the front desk, growing bitter by the hour. Outside the tall windows, snow fell lightly, not as a storm now, but as a patient reminder that winter had not finished with Silverpine. Caleb stood near the back wall with Bishop at his side. He had not meant to stay for the vote. At least, that was what he had told himself the morning after the roof cracked. He had done what he came to do, or as much of it as any man could claim without becoming dishonest. He had asked questions. He had followed records. He had listened when listening cost more than action. But Mabel had said nothing about whether he should go. That, somehow, kept him there. She sat near the front, not in the center of the room, but one chair in from the aisle, as if she refused both exile and ceremony. She wore her charcoal coat and the wine-red scarf, her silver, rail-shaped hairpin catching the library light whenever she turned her head. Her hands rested on the top of her cane. She did not look nervous. She looked deeply tired of being discussed. Graham Voss sat at a table beside Allison Greer and 2 other council members. His right hand was bandaged from the cut he had received during the storm. He had dressed with his usual care, dark suit, pale shirt, burgundy tie, but something in him had changed since the night at the depot. Not softened, not broken, more visible, perhaps, like a man standing closer to a window than he preferred. Mr. Leighton from North Star had taken a chair along the side wall. He carried a leather portfolio and the expression of a man recalculating profit in a room full of inconvenient memory. Marianne called the meeting to order, though she had no official authority to do so. No one objected. She stood at the front with a folder pressed against her chest, her glasses low on her nose, her hair pinned more carefully than usual, and still threatening to escape. When she looked out at the room, Caleb saw the fear in her. Not fear of speaking, fear that speaking might not matter. "This is not a trial," Marianne began. The room stayed quiet. "And I am not here to tell anyone what grief they are allowed to have." That sentence did more to settle the room than a demand for silence would have. Marianne opened the folder. "I am here because the library holds records. Some of them are official, some are incomplete, some are written carelessly, some are written with intent. But records are not memory by themselves. They become memory only when a community is willing to read them honestly." She laid the first page on the table where the council could see it. The newspaper editorial. "Fear cannot feed a town." A murmur moved through the room. Not surprise, recognition. Marianne did not read the cruelest lines dramatically. She read them plainly, which made them worse. The room heard again how one woman's caution had been turned into public blame, how hunger and fear had been given a name small enough for people to spit. Then she presented the early article describing Mabel's request for additional review, the North Ravine slide report, the copied county survey reference, Warren Ellery's written statement, the council summary that had reduced a safety recommendation into personal operational concern raised by station signal staff. Marianne's voice did not shake until the last page. "Mrs. Corwin did not invent the concern," she said. "The concern existed before her refusal. Her refusal made it inconvenient." No one spoke. That silence was different from the silence that had followed Mabel into coffee shops. It had weight, yes, but it also had witnesses. Paul Redding stood first. He had taken a seat near the aisle, and when he rose, the old chair creaked beneath the absence of him. He did not walk to the front. He simply removed his glasses, held them in both hands, and faced Mabel. "I was there," he said. The room turned toward him. Paul's voice was quiet, but years of preaching had taught him how to be heard without force. "At the meeting where Mrs. Corwin tried to explain. I was young then, new to the church. I wanted this town to trust me. I told myself anger needed room to cool. I told myself challenging it would only divide people further." He swallowed. "But what I called peace was only my own fear wearing clean clothes." No one moved. "My sin was not that I hated her. I did not. My sin was that I watched her be hated and called my silence wisdom." Mabel looked at him for a long moment, She did not nod. She did not smile. She did not absolve him because the room wanted release. Paul sat down slowly. The discomfort he left behind was sharper than accusation. Elias Benton rose next, though rising seemed to cost him. His old tweed cap twisted in his hands. He looked smaller under the library lights than he had inside the depot, but his voice, when it came, carried. "I worked the line," he said. "Most of you know that. Some of you are tired of hearing it, and I don't blame you." A few faces looked down. "I heard enough back then to know Mrs. Corwin wasn't making trouble from nothing. I heard men argue over North Ravine. I heard them say another review could cost us the season. When the contract collapsed, I let myself forget which part I had heard." He looked toward Mabel, but not directly into her face. Not yet. "My job went. My marriage went after.
I needed someone to blame because blaming myself was killing me, and blaming all of us felt too large to survive. So I let her stand alone with something I also knew was real." His fingers tightened around the cap. "I am not asking you to forgive me in front of these people," he said to Mabel. "That would be another way of making you work. I just want it said where I should have said it years ago." Mabel's hand closed around the top of her cane. "That will do," she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not rejection. It was exact. Nora Pike stood before anyone expected her to. She had been sitting near the back, arms crossed, boots planted hard, wearing the same brown Sherpa jacket she had worn to the library when she confronted Caleb. Her face showed no readiness for tenderness. If anything, she looked angry that the room had become solemn enough to require her honesty. "I don't like this," she said. A faint, nervous breath moved through the room. Nora did not care. "I don't like papers showing up after people are dead. I don't like being told the story I grew up with was easier than the truth. I don't like that my father needed a reason to hate himself less, and this town handed him Mrs. Corwin's name." Her voice roughened on the last line, but she did not let it break. "My father still lost his work. My mother still sold our house. We still became the kind of family people pitied at church and avoided at the store. None of this changes that." She looked at Mabel then. "But I won't call you a traitor again." The room held its breath. Nora's jaw worked once. "That's what I have today." Mabel watched her. Then she said, "Then bring that today. Do not borrow tomorrow before it arrives." Nora looked away fast, but not before Caleb saw her eyes shine. That was when he understood the vote had already changed, whatever the count became. Not because everyone had repented. Because the old story could no longer move through the room without being challenged by someone's own mouth. Graham stood last. For a moment, Caleb thought he might retreat into procedure. No one would have been surprised. A man like Graham could bury discomfort beneath motions, amendments, fiscal language, consultant recommendations. It would have been the familiar road, clean and safe. Instead, he placed both palms on the table and looked at the room before looking at Mabel. "My father believed the rail expansion would save Silverpine," he said. "I was raised inside that belief. Many of us were raised inside it, whether we knew it or not." He glanced briefly toward the editorial on Marianne's table. "I am not prepared to stand here and pretend one meeting changes 30 years of decline. The depot still leaks. Our tax base is still weak. Businesses are still fragile. Adults still leave town because good intentions do not pay rent." A few people nodded. Caleb was glad he said it.
A false ending would have required everyone to forget poverty in order to honor truth. Graham continued, "But I am also no longer willing to ask this town to buy a future by repeating a falsehood about Mabel Corwin." There it was, her name. Not Mrs. Corwin, as a title placed safely at a distance. Not the station woman. Not that employee. Mabel Corwin. Graham lifted a sheet of paper. "I propose the original sale motion be withdrawn." Mr. Layton shifted sharply in his chair. Graham did not look at him. "In its place, I propose a revised development framework. The main depot structure will be transferred into a community trust pending legal review. The rear parcel may be leased under limited terms to North Star or another partner, with revenue dedicated to structural repairs, heat, insurance, and winter operations. The waiting room will serve as an emergency warming station during designated winter nights. The East Office will become a public archive of the rail history, including the expansion failure, the North Ravine records, and the role of Mrs. He stopped, then corrected himself without hiding it. Mabel Corwin. No one clapped. That would have been too easy. But Caleb saw Allison Greer write the correction into her notes. That mattered. The discussion that followed was not beautiful. It was long, practical, sometimes petty. People asked about insurance, liability, staffing, heating oil, volunteer schedules, zoning, lease terms, and whether North Star would walk away. Mr. Layton spoke carefully of reduced scope and adjusted projections. June Callahan stood and offered to coordinate donations of blankets and shelf-stable food through local inns. Paul offered the church basement as overflow storage. Mary Ann agreed to manage the archive, provided no one used the phrase "Little Museum of Healing" in her presence. Elias offered to mark the old rail maps accurately. Nora said nothing for nearly an hour. Then, when Allison mentioned door hardware and seating repair, Nora raised one hand. "I can fix leather poles, bench straps, some upholstery. Not for free forever, but for the start." Her eyes did not go to Mabel. Mabel's did not go to hers. Still, the offer entered the record. By the time the vote was taken, the coffee had gone cold, and the snow had stopped. The revised motion passed. Not unanimously. That mattered too. A few people voted no because they thought the plan impractical. One abstained. Mr. Layton looked displeased, but not gone. Graham looked exhausted. Mary Ann looked as if she might sleep for a week. Mabel remained seated until everyone else began to rise. Several people approached her, then thought better of whatever speech they had prepared. One man removed his hat and simply said, "Evening, Mabel," before leaving. She answered, "Evening." It was not much. It was more than had existed the day before. Caleb walked back to Callahan House under a clearing sky. Bishop moved beside him, his paws silent in the soft snow. The depot's broken west panel had been covered with a temporary tarp, dark against the white roof. It looked wounded. It also looked claimed. The next morning came bright and cold. Sunlight flashed across the snowpack so intensely that the whole town seemed carved from glass. Caleb loaded his duffel into the truck before breakfast. June came out, carrying a paper bag of biscuits and a thermos of coffee. "For the road," she said. "You trying to keep me from leaving?" "No, I'm trying to make sure you leave with food. There's a difference." He accepted the bag. June looked toward the depot. "You'll stop there first?" "Yes." "Good." She rubbed her hands together against the cold. "Tell her the blankets are coming this afternoon. And don't tell her I said she looked tired.
She knows.
Yes, but she enjoys making people regret saying it.
Caleb smiled. That she does.
At the depot, the door stood open. That was new. Inside, the waiting room was cold but alive with small efforts. Mary Ann sat on the floor near the east office, labeling boxes with a pencil. Elias stood before the old North Ravine map, carefully pinning a transparent overlay across it. Paul carried a stack of folded chairs from the storage room. June's promised blankets had not yet arrived, but someone had already placed 2 wool throws across a bench near the stove. Nora was at the ticket counter. She did not look up when Caleb entered. In her hands was a strip of dark brown leather, newly cut and polished. She fed it through an old brass handle on the inner door, pulled it tight, and tested the grip. The repaired pull looked plain, strong, and meant to last. Mabel sat by the window with a cup of tea before her. A chair stood empty beside her. On the floor near that chair lay a thick folded blanket. Not one of the old depot throws. This one was clean, dark green, and placed exactly where Bishop would choose to lie if he were given options. Bishop saw it. His ears tipped forward. Mabel did not look at him. If he puts snow on that blanket, I will complain. Caleb walked toward her. He'll survive your disappointment. He has so far. Bishop circled once and lay down between the empty chair and Mabel's boots, his head settling near her feet. After a moment, Mabel lowered her hand and rested it against the scarred edge of his left ear. Caleb looked at the chair. Who put that there? Mabel sipped her tea. People who have discovered furniture can be political. Should I sit? That depends. Are you leaving? Yes. Then sit before you become sentimental in a doorway. He sat. For a while, they watched the others work. No speeches filled the room. No one announced a new beginning. The depot still smelled of damp wood and old dust. The roof still needed repair. The vote still needed lawyers, insurance, money, cooperation, and a dozen other things more difficult than emotion. Some people in Silverpine would continue to grumble. Some would never admit they had been wrong. Mabel would still walk past windows where conversations paused. But the chair beside her had been kept. And for a woman who had been given emptiness as punishment, a kept chair was not a small thing. Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and took out the old letter. The folds were soft now from being handled. He placed it on the table beside her tea. I should give this back. Mabel looked at it. It was addressed to you. I read it too late. You came before it was useless. He leaned back, feeling the ache in his lower spine and something quieter beneath it. I don't know what I came here to do anymore. Good, Mabel said. Men are less dangerous when they lose certainty. He laughed softly. Then her hand, still resting on Bishop's head, stilled. I do not need the whole town to love me, she said. I know. I do not need statues or speeches or some plaque declaring me brave in language that makes everyone feel clean. I know. She looked out the window at the snow-bright square. I only need them to stop using me to hate themselves. Caleb followed her gaze. Across the street, Graham Voss stood outside the town hall, speaking with Allison Greer. He looked over once toward the depot. He did not wave. Mabel did not either. But he did not look away quickly. That, too, was a beginning. Caleb rose after his tea had gone cold. Mabel did not stand. Bishop did, reluctantly, shaking his coat and nudging her knee once with his muzzle. She placed one hand on his head, not clinging,
not pretending she would not miss him. "You were taught properly," she told him. Bishop pressed his forehead briefly into her palm. Caleb put on his gloves. "All right," he said. "You said that before." "I was worse then." "Yes," Mabel said. "You were." He waited. She looked up at him, eyes clear, mouth stern, grief and amusement folded so closely together that separating them would have been dishonest. "Be less late this time." "I will." Outside, the air was bright enough to hurt. Caleb crossed to his truck with Bishop at his side. At the edge of town, he stopped once and looked back. Silverpine had not transformed overnight. It had not become kind by vote. Its past had not been washed white by snow, and Mabel Corwin had not been restored to some simple place of honor that would make the story easier to tell. But the depot door was open. Smoke rose from its chimney. A woman who had been used as a wound sat inside with tea, a map, and a chair someone had thought to leave beside her. Caleb drove east as the sun rose over the pines. Bishop settled on the seat beside him, tired and quiet. He did not feel victorious. Victory was too loud a word for what had happened. What he carried instead was a steadier thing. The knowledge that some truths could not return the years, revive the dead, rebuild every lost house, or make suffering beautiful. But spoken carefully, and held by more than one pair of hands, truth could stop people from passing the same harm into the next winter. Behind him, Silverpine grew smaller in the mirror. Ahead, the road shone white beneath the morning sun. Sometimes the hardest thing God asks of us is not to win an argument, but to stand quietly for what is right when no one understands it yet. Mabel's story reminds us that truth does not always arrive with applause. Sometimes it waits in old rooms, in forgotten records, in the courage of one person who refuses to call danger safe just to make others comfortable. In our own lives, may we be careful with the stories we repeat, gentle with the people we do not fully understand, and brave enough to choose honesty even when it costs us. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what moment stayed with you the most. And if you'd like more stories of courage, grace, and quiet redemption, please subscribe and join us for the next one. May God give you peace, wisdom, and the strength to do what is right, even when the world is slow to see it.